Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a situation, right, where you've got an official report commissioned at the highest level, laying out clear findings, but then the public story that follows just completely contradicts what that report actually said. Well, that's not just a hypothetical. It's exactly what we're diving into today. We're looking at a really significant recent revelation within the Catholic Church. It concerns Pope Francis's big decree from 2021, Traditionis Custodes, and how it affects the traditional Latin Mass. And this isn't just, about old rituals or complicated theology. It really gets into transparency, how information gets used, and, well, the huge impact of decisions made way up high. Now, before we get any further, we really want to point you to where this reflection comes from. These insights we're discussing, the ones underpinning this whole deep dive, you can find them at www.epistles.online. Our conversation today is pulling heavily from Diane Montaigne's, frankly, bombshell exclusive article on Substack. It's titled Exclusive. Official Vatican Report Exposes Major Cracks in Foundation of Traditionis Custodes. And we also want to mention the author providing these reflections on www.epistles.online. He offers even more in-depth discussion. You can often find that on the Catholic Epistles podcast, which is also linked through the website. So definitely check this out for a fuller picture. Okay, so let's set the scene a bit. Pope Francis's decree, Traditionis Custodes, or TC, came out July 2021. It was a motu proprio, meaning on his own initiative, and it put significant new restrictions on celebrating the traditional Latin Mass. You often hear it called the TLM, or the extraordinary form. Now, his public reason for this big shift was very clear. He said it was based on feedback he got from bishops all over the world. He claimed their answers showed a situation that was, and these are his words, worrying and sad, and that this convinced him intervention was urgently needed. So the message was, the bishops themselves indicated widespread problems requiring these restrictions.
Yeah, and that's exactly where things get really interesting, isn't it? Because that's the core of what we're talking about today. This newly revealed Vatican document just presents such a stark contrast. And we're not talking about some leak or rumor. This is the official summary of that very consultation of bishops. The one about Pope Benedict the Sixth earlier decree, Summorum Pontificum, which had actually, liberalized the traditional Latin Mass. And this report, which wasn't public before, tells a completely different story than the one Pope Francis presented. It shows that the majority of bishops who actually responded, they were pretty satisfied with how the TLM was going in their diocese. And even more importantly, the report says most bishops explicitly warned against making changes or limiting Summorum Pontificum. They basically said, look, doing this would cause more harm than good. So it really raises the massive question, right? If the internal report from the very bishops whose feedback was supposedly the reason for the decree suggested the opposite, well, why issue a decree citing widespread concern?
Exactly. And that's our mission today, really, to distill what this internal Vatican document actually revealed, especially the parts that, weren't mentioned in Traditionis Custodes or that accompanying letter he sent out. We want to help you understand the facts that were apparently available inside the Vatican at the time and just how sharply they seem to differ from the story that was told publicly. It's about getting to grips with what was known internally versus, well, what was communicated externally. Okay, so let's just revisit that public stance Pope Francis took July 16th, 2021. He issues Traditionis Custodes. And in the letter he sent to the bishops explaining it, he's very explicit. He says their responses to the questionnaire reveal a situation that preoccupies and saddens me and persuades me of the need to intervene. That's a direct quote. And he went further, didn't he? He claimed the whole pastoral goal of his predecessors, John Paul II and Benedict XVI, their goal of healing wounds, restoring unity by allowing the 1962 Missal. He said that goal was seriously disregarded. He basically painted a picture of failure. Right. He said the opportunities offered by John Paul II and with even greater magnanimity by Benedict XVI were exploited to widen the gaps, reinforce the divergences, and encourage disagreements that injure the church.
Strong words.
Very strong. Block her path and expose her to the peril of division. And his conclusion was pretty blunt. He told the bishops he felt constrained by their requests to revoke Summorum Pontificum.
So the narrative was dire situation, division, bishops asking for intervention. That was the story. And that narrative just crumbles when you look at this overall assessment section from the official CDF report. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, the Vatican's main doctrinal office. This section is crucial because it's where the CDF experts synthesize everything. They interpret the survey results, give their evaluative conclusion based on all the evidence they gathered. It's their informed judgment. And what it reveals, it flat out contradicts Pope Francis's stated reason. The core finding is just unambiguous. It says, I'm quoting here from the reporting on it, The majority of bishops who responded to the questionnaire stated that making legislative changes to Summorum Pontificum would cause more harm than good.
More harm than good. Not we need changes.
Exactly. Not only not asking for revocation, but actively warning against changes. And it gets even more specific. Remember Pope Francis talking about gaps, divergences, disagreements? Well, the report suggests those issues, where they existed, actually stemmed more from, and this is key, naes, prejudice, and resistance of a minority of bishops towards Summorum Pontificum.
Ah, so not from the people attending the TLM itself.
Not primarily, according to this assessment. It points the finger more towards a segment of the hierarchy resisting Benedict's move, rather than problems caused by the faithful using the older liturgy. It basically flips the script on where the disunity was coming from.
Huh.
And there's another detail here reported by Diane Montaigne, which is just wow. Apparently, Pope Francis literally snatched a working copy out of Cardinal Ladaria's hands. Ladaria was the head of the CDF then.
Severe.
Just did it. Which, if true, strongly suggests he had direct personal access to this document with these conclusions before he issued TC.
Which makes the public narrative even more puzzling.
Exactly. Puzzling is a good word.
Okay, that detail about the report being snatched certainly paints a picture. Direct engagement, seems like. So tell us a bit more about how this report actually came together, its background, how it was structured. It gives it weight, right?
Absolutely. It wasn't just some informal polling. The whole process was formally entrusted to the fourth section of the CDF. Now, before TC, most people knew this body as the Pontifical Ecclesia Dei Commission. And these were the guys with extensive hands-on experience. They had supervised Summorum Pontificum since it began.
So the specialists.
Precisely. They knew the landscape, the practicalities, the issues that had come up over the years.
Yeah.
They were perfectly positioned to analyze the feedback intelligently. The process kicked off in spring 2020. Cardinal Ladaria sent out a detailed questionnaire to the presidents of all the Episcopal conferences worldwide. And the instruction was, get this to your diocesan bishops for their direct input.
So straight from the source.
Right. And the responses came flooding in, apparently, until about January 2021 from all over the globe in different languages. The fourth section then had the massive task of processing all that data, analyzing it, and synthesizing it into this final report.
A truly global effort, then, taking nearly a year, handled by the experts. What did the final product look like?
It was a pretty hefty document, dated February 2021, 224 pages in total, structured in two main parts. Part I was the really granular analysis, continent by continent, sometimes country by country breakdown of the survey results, lots of charts, graphs, showing the trends.
Okay, the raw data, visualize.
Pretty much. Then part two was called the summary, or synthesi. This was more concise, more interpretive. It had an introduction, summaries for each continent. And then the section we're really focusing on, the overall assessment, the juditio complessico. That's where the CDF gave its main evaluative conclusions, the bombshell stuff.
Right.
And part two also included a collection of direct quotes from the bishops, organized by theme. Apparently, this was put together specifically to give Pope Francis a representative taste of what the bishops were actually saying. Interestingly, the overall assessment starts by noting Summorum Pontificum had a significant, albeit relatively modest, role. It had spread to maybe 20% of Latin dioceses worldwide by then.
Okay, so not everywhere, but significant where it was.
Yes, and generally implemented in a way that was more serene and peaceful, though not everywhere. So, mostly positive, but acknowledging some exceptions. That context is important. #tagged key revelations from the overall assessment, the 7 takeaways. Okay, let's dive into the really striking findings from this overall assessment. The first big takeaway tackles that question of liturgical disunity head-on. The report found that where there was a lack of peace, it seemed to stem more from, quote, nescience, prejudice, and resistance of a minority of bishops towards Summorum Pontificum.
So ignorance, bias, and pushback from some bishops.
That's what the report suggests, rather than inherent problems coming from the people who attended the traditional Latin Mass.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. And they link this resistance back to Pope Benedict's whole vision, his desire for internal liturgical reconciliation, the hermeneutic of continuity, renewal that respects tradition. The report explicitly says this ecclesiological dimension has not yet been fully embraced by some bishops.
Meaning the friction was often top-down resistance to Benedict's idea, not bottom-up trouble from the pews.
That seems to be the assessment, yes.
That really reframes the whole problem, doesn't it? Can you give some examples of what the report actually said about these bishops' views? How did this resistance manifest?
Sure. The report mentions some bishops saw the TLM not as, a valid spiritual path, but as inappropriate, disturbing, useless, and even dangerous.
Dangerous, wow.
Yeah. And they explicitly wanted it suppressed or very tightly controlled.
Mm.
It even pointed out regional things like Spanish-speaking bishops often showing little interest, even when people were asking for it, a disconnect.
Mm-hmm.
And Italian bishops, mostly, didn't hold the extraordinary form in high regard. The report also tackled some misunderstandings bishops had.
Mm.
Like, some thought Summorum Pontificum failed because it didn't bring the SSPX fully back into the fold.
The Society of St. Pius X, right?
Yes. But the report clarified, look, reconciliation is slow, and Summorum Pontificum wasn't primarily for the SSPX anyway. It was for Catholics in good standing who wanted the older Mass.
Okay, important clarification.
Definitely. And while it acknowledged fears some bishops had, like TLM groups causing division or rejecting Vatican II,
A Second Vatican Council, yeah.
it stressed these fears were partly true, maybe in some cases, but cannot be generalized. Big difference. And it emphasized that the bishop's pastoral care was often key to smoothing things over.
So, good leadership mattered.
Crucially, finally, it noted some bishops actually preferred going back to the older indult system,
Why?
basically for greater control. They wanted more direct management, rather than the kind of local freedom Summorum Pontificum allowed.
So, less about solving problems, more about asserting authority for some.
That seems to be an implication drawn in the report, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It really challenges that idea of widespread problems coming from the TLM communities themselves.
Okay, understanding the source of disunity is vital. And that leads right into the second big revelation, which feels like the absolute core counterpoint to TC, the finding of widespread satisfaction with Summorum Pontificum. The report plainly states the majority of bishops who responded, and who have generously and intelligently implemented the MP Summorum Pontificum, ultimately express satisfaction with it.
Yeah, that's just a direct hit on the stated rationale for TC, isn't it?
Completely. And it also highlighted a really positive outcome. In places where the clergy have closely cooperated with the bishop, the situation has become completely pacified. Peace, stability, not chaos.
Exactly. The report really emphasized this view that the TLM is a treasure of the church to be safeguarded, something good to find unity with the past, and meeting real spiritual needs. It achieved peace, allowed choice, fulfilled Benedict's hopes. But here's the really crucial part, the warning. Based on this satisfaction, the report predicted, clearly, that weakening or suppressing Summorum Pontificum would seriously damage the life of the church,
Damage it.
as it would recreate the tensions that the document had helped to resolve. So the very action taken was predicted internally to cause the problems it claimed to solve.
Wow. That's a stunning prediction, given what happened next.
And the report didn't pull any punches about what that damage might look like, did it? What were the specific warnings from bishops?
No, they were quite stark, really. The report laid out that making these changes could, 1, foster the departure of disappointed faithful from the Church toward the Society of St. Pius X or to other schismatic groups.
A major unity concern. Huge. 2, it warned it could foster distrust toward Rome, hitting confidence in the Vatican's judgment. 3, it predicted a resurgence of the liturgical wars, reigniting old fights that had mostly died down.
Which, as you said, nobody wanted.
Right. And 4, maybe the most serious,
Mm-hmm.
potentially fostering the emergence of a new schism.
Schism. That's the nuclear option in church terms.
Absolutely. These aren't trivial warnings. And there was another key point. Such a move would delegitimize two pontiffs, John Paul II and Benedict VI.
How so?
Because they had both committed to caring for these faithful, finding a place for them. Reversing that would undermine their legacy and the continuity of papal approach.
So serious warnings about unity, trust, peace, and even papal legacy, all apparently ignored.
It certainly seems that way, based on this report versus the final decision. Okay, moving to the third key point from the assessment. This one's about the CDF's fourth section, the Old Ecclesia Dei Commission. The report highlighted really widespread gratitude from bishops for the work this body did.
What was their role exactly?
They were seen as crucial for keeping the peace, providing consistent guidance on the traditional liturgy. The report credits them with helping to prevent arbitrary forms of self-management and anarchy within the groups, so keeping things orderly on one side, and also preventing abuses of power by some local bishops on the other, kind of a mediating, stabilizing force.
A respected referee, almost.
In a way, yes. Bishops repeatedly expressed satisfaction and gratitude for their work. They saw it as effective oversight and pastoral care.
Which makes it even more striking that.
Exactly. This very body, praised for maintaining order and dialogue, was effectively disbanded right after Traditionis Custodes came out.
Why dismantle something that was apparently working and appreciated?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? It removes a mechanism that the bishops themselves seem to value for preventing chaos.
A critical point indeed. And speaking of things working well, the fourth revelation, the confirmation that young people are drawn to the traditional Latin Mass. This wasn't just a guess, right? It backed up Pope Benedict's own feeling.
Absolutely. Benedict had written about this intuition, and the report says this was a constant observation made by the bishops across the board.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me. It wasn't just, older folks.
No, quite the opposite. The report describes the core demographic of stable TLM groups as mostly young people,
Mm-hmm.
and significantly, often converts to the Catholic faith or those returning after a time away.
Converts and returnees, that's huge. That's new life, not just nostalgia.
Precisely. It signals a dynamism, not just preservation. It shows the TLM acting as a gateway into or back into active faith for a younger generation. And the report went into why. What was attracting them? It wasn't just aesthetics, though beauty was part of it. It lists things like sacredness, seriousness, and solemnity.
Things may be lacking elsewhere.
Perhaps also the rediscovery of silence within sacred actions, the restrained and essential words, which contrasts with maybe more verbose styles.
Mhm.
They appreciated preaching that is faithful to the Church's doctrine, the beauty of liturgical chant, and the overall dignity of the celebration.
A whole package.
Yes, the report called it a seamless whole that is deeply attractive to them. It suggests a real spiritual hunger being met. It validates Benedict's idea that this form of the liturgy has a genuine contemporary appeal and serves a real purpose for spiritual growth.
Incredibly insightful. Shows a real positive draw. And number 5 connects directly to that vitality, right? The growth in vocations. The report noted actual growth in priestly and religious vocations in those Ecclesia Dei communities, the ones focused on the TLM since Summorum Pontificum.
Yes, undeniable growth, which is always seen as a vital sign for the Church. But interestingly, the report also picked up on a slight tension there. It noted that some diocesan bishops are not entirely pleased by this.
Not pleased by more vocations? That sounds strange.
Well, the report suggests the issue is where the vocations were going. It says many young men are choosing to enter the Ecclesia Dei institutes, rather than diocesan seminaries, to the manifest regret of some bishops.
So a perceived competition. They wanted those men for their own dioceses.
That seems to be the implication. So even as the Church as a whole benefited, some local leaders felt they were losing out, revealing a sort of internal tension.
Okay, that nuance is interesting. Which leads nicely to the 6th point, a practical suggestion about seminary training. The report actually recommended something based on bishops' own ideas, right? About including the TLM in seminary formation.
Yes, exactly. The idea surfaced from the consultation itself to include sessions dedicated to the study of both forms of the Roman Rite, the traditional Latin Mass, and the ordinary form, the Novus Ordo in seminary programs.
And the thinking behind that.
Purely practical and pastoral. It was seen as a way to foster greater unity and peace. If you prepare priests who are comfortable and knowledgeable in both forms, they're better equipped to serve everyone, right?
Yes.
It could increase diocesan vocations overall because priests wouldn't feel limited. It aimed to create suitably formed priests ready for the diversity of the Church.
So promoting understanding, bridging divides, better serving the faithful, a very integrated vision.
Yes, a unifying approach rather than an etherer.
And finally, the 7th takeaway, perhaps the most powerful in its simplicity. The report's conclusion, echoing a Filipino bishop.
Let the people be free to choose. That's the quote highlighted from the Filipino bishop, summarizing a core sentiment from the findings. And it resonates so strongly with what Pope Benedict XVI himself said back in 2008 to the French bishops about Summorum Pontificum. He said, and it's worth hearing again, everyone has a place in the Church. Every person, without exception, should be able to feel at home and never rejected.
Powerful words.
God, who loves all men and women and wishes none to be lost, entrusts us with this mission. Let us therefore strive always to be servants of unity. That vision of welcome, of inclusion, seems perfectly aligned with the report's findings and that bishop's simple plea.
Which again raises that big question.
Exactly. If the internal report reflecting the bishop's views supported this open, welcoming approach, why was the path taken so much more restrictive? The gap between the data and the decree is just stark. It really begs for an explanation. Hashtag the impact and implications.
Okay, so we've talked about the theory, the disconnect between the report and the decree. But this isn't just academic, is it? We're seeing real-world consequences. I mean, look at what's happening right now, or very recently, in places like the Archdiocese of Detroit. The new archbishop there announced back in April that as of July 1st, 2025, the traditional Latin Mass can no longer be celebrated in actual parish churches.
Hmm. Pushed out to other locations, if allowed at all.
Right, and the justification given. It directly cited a 2023 Vatican rescript, like a formal reply from Cardinal Arthur Roche at the Dicastery for Divine Worship, which basically said bishops don't have the authority anymore to allow the TLM in parish churches. A direct follow-on from TC.
And the Detroit example is particularly jarring when you compare it to what Detroit itself said in the original consultation. Diane Montagna actually got hold of the specific response from the former Archbishop of Detroit, Alan Vigneron, to that 2020 Vatican survey.
And what did he say back then?
His advice was completely different. It mirrored what the CDF report said was the majority view. Archbishop Vigneron wrote, and this is a direct quote from his survey response, "My advice is to maintain the discipline and norms set out in Summorum Pontificum, and to deal with any problems by calling priests and people to observe them."
So stick with what works.
Exactly, he continued. The motu proprio Summorum Pontificum has given us a remarkably successful approach to resolving the contention. The discipline it has put in place is bearing much good fruit, especially in the lives of the faithful and in restoring ecclesial peace.
Remarkable success. Ecclesial peace, not division and worry.
Not at all, he added. There is no question in my mind about the legitimacy of the extraordinary form. Such celebrations are in no way a threat to the ordinary form. They enrich her in her diversity. By my lights, Summorum Pontificum has been a remarkable success.
So what does this mean for people in Detroit and maybe elsewhere? You have their own former leaders saying it was a success, bringing peace. Yet now, based on TC and its interpretations, the opposite is happening. Restrictions are coming in, disrupting the very peace that was reported.
It's a perfect illustration of the disconnect.
Yeah. It shows how the policy eventually implemented seems completely at odds with the reality reported by the bishops on the ground just a short time before.
Absolutely. And, even before this report surfaced, the justification for Traditionis Custodes felt weak to many people, especially when you saw the obvious positive fruits. The growing popularity, the young people, the strong families it fostered, the vocations, as the report itself confirmed.
Things you could actually see happening.
Right. So this new discovery, this confirmation of what the CDF's own assessment concluded based on the bishop's feedback, it just throws massive doubt on the whole foundation and credibility of Traditionis Custodes. The report makes it crystal clear. Summorum Pontificum was largely seen as bringing peace, deepening faith, offering hope, especially to the young and returning Catholics. It allowed coexistence that let people choose. And the flip side seems true too. Traditionis Custodes, instead of solving old problems, appears to have created a host of new ones, new divisions, new anxieties. Remember, the report identified the main source of any existing problems, not with the TLM communities, but with that minority of bishops, showing nescience, prejudice, and resistance.
So the solution maybe didn't match the actual problem identified internally?
It certainly looks that way. The report consistently pointed to cooperation between bishops and priests leading to peace. It showed coexistence was working. It affirmed the value people found, the sacredness, beauty, reverence, and it warned explicitly that suppression could push people away towards groups like the SSPX and damage the legacy of the previous popes who tried to foster unity.
That final recommendation, let the people be free to choose.
It really captures the pastoral spirit that the majority of bishops seem to support, according to this document, a spirit that seems to have been overridden.
It leaves you with a profound sense of disconnect between the internal findings and the external actions. #outro.
Wow, we have certainly covered a lot of ground today, really peeling back the layers on this significant revelation. Just to recap the main point, we have an official Vatican report based on a worldwide consultation of bishops that paints a radically different picture than the one given publicly to justify Traditionis Custodes.
The narrative doesn't match the data. Right. The facts revealed in this internal document really challenge the credibility of that public narrative. The majority of bishops, satisfied, they warned against changes. They saw the benefits of the TLM, the peace it brought, the young people it attracted, the vocations it fostered.
And, this whole situation digging into these documents, it brings up a really critical point, not just for the church, but maybe for any large organization, any situation where information flows or doesn't flow. It leaves you, the listener, with a question, doesn't it? In a world just flooded with information, how do we really get the full picture? especially when not all the pieces are put on the table initially, or when the official story seems to diverge from the internal facts.
Yeah.
And what does it mean for unity, for trust, when these differing perspectives on really fundamental things come out? Especially when they come from detailed, official internal work. It's not just about this specific policy, it's about transparency, decision-making, and how institutions navigate diversity, internal feedback. Something to really mull over.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It's been fascinating, if challenging, to explore. We really encourage you to keep exploring these topics, dig into the facts for yourself, and try to discern that full picture. For more of these unique insights and reflections, and to find links to Diane Montaña's original article and related content, please do visit www.epistles.online. You'll find more from the author. He provides these incredible perspectives that really help you stay informed. And for more conversations like this one, tackling these vital subjects, make sure you subscribe to the Catholic Epistles podcast. Until next time, keep digging, keep asking questions, and keep learning. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.